and welcome to Crime Bytes, the show where we talk about some truly bizarre and disturbing crime cases. My name is Liz, and today is True Crime Tuesday. Okay, so I finally saw the movie, and I'm glad it wasn't as bad, in my humble opinion, as the reviews made it out to be. I went in there pretty worried, honestly. I was a little disappointed, but there were a lot of things I liked about it at the same time, and I'm still Team Robbie for Harley, but I do think Lady Gaga did a great job as well. I don't know, wasn't Harley traditionally the Joker psychiatrist? I could definitely be wrong, but that part was off for me, and I did like how they made them out to be almost cute amidst the sad and terrible circumstances that they had essentially put themselves in. Anyhow, I didn't like how they killed him at the end either, although they did kind of pave the way for a different kind of Joker to emerge, like an actual psychopath, which Joaquin's Joker wasn't really. He was to an extent, but he cared about some people, which true psychopaths aren't actually capable of, so I guess he was a sociopath. Anyhow, the ending was sad but fitting, I guess, and I'm glad I saw it, and I did like it, but it wasn't quite what I was expecting, that's for sure. Oh, and there was an ad for Team Rubicon as well as the theater, which I thought was really cool. Check them out if you haven't yet. So having seen the movie, I am excited to tell you a tale of Follie A Duex that occurred between lovers today. But before we do that, I just want to say go get your Crime Bytes hoodie and unique jewelry at my Etsy store. It's Funky Sharky. I'll leave a link in the description, and you can use coupon code CRIME20 to get 20% off between now and New Year's. I just made these bloody eyeball earrings. Totally not inspired at all by the Pepin sisters. They would have been perfect for last week's episode, but they're up there under my Halloween jewelry as well. Alright, let's get to today's story, and today we're visiting Virginia in the 80s, but before we go there we have to visit South Africa and Thailand in the 60s. We're going to start by meeting Elizabeth Haysom, who was born in South Africa in 1964 to Nancy and Derek Haysom. Derek had 4 children from a previous marriage, and Nancy had 2, but they wanted to raise their own child together, so they decided to add Elizabeth to their family. She was 10 years younger to her eldest half-sibling, which was a pretty big gap, and she was described as needing a lot of attention. She was described as having a flair for drama on and off stage. So she was born in South Africa, then sent to boarding school in London. Her father was apparently a very well-off engineer, and her parents were hoping that she would go in that direction as well. So they attempted to load her up on science and math classes, but she didn't really do as well there as with her artistic type courses, and she even ended up having to spend an extra year in high school because of that. She would actually hold a lot of resentment toward her parents for a few incidences that occurred while she was growing up. She would even claim to be assaulted a few times and having her claims ignored, and as a result, she would say she became very angry and bitter, which, if she's telling the truth, and I only say that because in this story there's just a lot of her stories that have been brought into question, but if it is true, it's completely understandable, and if it isn't, it's a darn good excuse to give. Anyhow, she would end up being expelled from her high school for experimenting with drugs and homosexuality, which was a no-no back then at her prep school. She actually got into a relationship with another girl in her class, and the pair would travel around Europe for a little, working odd jobs and stealing what they could to get by. They made it through France, Italy, and Germany before they kind of ran out of money and steam, and then went to the British consulate to ask for train tickets back to Britain. Elizabeth would move back with her parents, who would just be about to move to Virginia for Derek's work, and Elizabeth decided to move with them. She would decide to enroll in the University of Virginia from there, and it was there in the summer of 1984 that Elizabeth met Jens Soering. Now we're going to jump back to 1966 in Bangkok, Thailand, when Jens Soering is born to German diplomat Claude Soering. Jens's father was known to have a bit of a temper, and his wife was a bit of an alcoholic. His family would move to America in 1977, and Jens would attend high school in Atlanta. He did very well in high school and was accepted to the University of Virginia as a Jefferson Scholar, which was very prestigious, and it came with a full scholarship as well as spending money. Can you imagine? It was here that he would meet Elizabeth. Jens wasn't very popular on campus, but Elizabeth found that they had a lot in common when she started talking to him. They both weren't very fond of Americans, and they both resented their parents. That was something they really started to bond over. They would start meeting in the Treehouse, which was their campus snack bar, after finding themselves at a movie screening together. By December, Elizabeth had confessed her love for Jens and wrote him a letter that read, "I hated you for a long time. I hated myself for discovering vulnerability, but as the weeks passed, I began to understand I had always believed that I had made men fall in love with me so that I could take out all the hatred I felt for them by humiliating them. I despised their cheap lust and easy passions. In the end, I made them hate themselves for loving me and the torture I inflicted. I would make a man humiliate himself to obtain me. Then I would give him the best he's ever likely to get and walk out. I love you, and it may alter intensity and direction from time to time, but I will always love you with part of me that no one else will be able to snatch." I don't know why she sounds like that in my head, but there's a lot there, and I think that it says a lot about her. Anyhow, this was in December and during winter break, and Elizabeth and Jens would be back with their parents. She would be in Virginia and he would be in Michigan. They would start to write to one another, and at times their correspondence would get really dark. Jens would write things like, "Were I to meet your parents, I have the ultimate weapon. Strange things are happening within me. I'm turning more and more into a Christ figure. Small imitation anyways, I think. I believe I could either make them completely lose their wits, get heart attacks, or they would become lovers in an agape kind of way to the rest of the world." To which Elizabeth would respond with things like, "Would it be possible to hypnotize my parents, do voodoo on them, will them to death? It seems my concentration on their death is causing them problems. My father nearly drove over a cliff at lunch. He nearly got squashed by a tree when he got home, and he keeps falling over. And my mother, drunk, fell into the fire. I think I shall take up black magic." Okay, so yes, things are looking a bit shifty here, to say the least. The pair would reunite that spring, and at one point Elizabeth's parents would come out to visit the couple and take them out to lunch. Elizabeth's parents really didn't care much for Jens either when they met him, and afterwards they even encouraged Elizabeth to consider her options. She didn't hide their dislike from Jens either, and obviously he wasn't happy about that. He couldn't really understand why they wouldn't like him. On March 29th, Elizabeth and Jens would rent a car and drive to Washington, D.C. and book a room at the Marriott. They went to the movies to see Porky's Revenge and the Rocky Horror Picture Show. The next day, they spent the day walking around the neighborhood, seeing the sights before driving back to Charlottesville the next day. On April 3rd of 1985, Annie Macy was feeling nervous. She had arrived at the Haysom household with two of her friends for a bridge game with Mr. Haysom. No one was answering the door, but their cars were in the driveway. Their porch light was also on despite the daytime hour. Annie had a spare key, so after Mr. Haysom didn't answer for a little while, she let herself and their friends into the house, and as soon as she entered, it was like the nagging fear she was trying to keep back just exploded into her vision, because right in the door, she saw her friend Derek sprawled on the ground and just covered in blood. The whole house looked like it was covered in blood. She would call the police, and they would find Nancy in the kitchen, also covered in blood, but the blood around her was kind of circled around as if someone was attempting to wash that one part, and not well even. Both Derek and Nancy's throats had been cut from ear to ear, and both had sustained multiple stab wounds. An investigation would ensue, and the first notable thing that they found was no sign of forced entry. There were some footprints in the blood as well, one made by a tennis shoe and two made by a sock. They found all 4 types of blood at the crime scene. The Haysoms had A and AB blood types, but they found a bit of B type on a damp rag and some O type blood on the screen door and in the master suite. So at first, everyone obviously felt very sorry for Elizabeth, but as time went on and all other leads were cleared, the police decided to focus in on her whereabouts, and they found a few things. They would meet with her on the 8th of April, and she would tell them all about her weekend with Jens. One pretty key thing was that they found the car that she and Jens had rented right around that time had been driven for hundreds of miles. More miles than it would have taken them, or at least one of them, to at least drive the car from Charlottesville to Washington. When they asked Elizabeth about this, though, she told them that they had gotten lost quite a bit trying to get around Washington, but they must have gotten very lost by the mileage, if that's correct. A suspect profile from the FBI also said that the murderer was probably a female who knew the family. Elizabeth's demeanor was definitely questionable, and that should never really be what you base your opinion on, because some people might react oddly if their parents were murdered. Everyone would react differently. But when you combine a reaction of almost indifferent with a few other things, it does seem worth noting. So Elizabeth was initially cooperative, but it seemed like they were kind of being closed in on, and Jens didn't want to give blood or fingerprint samples, fearing that he would get in trouble with the German authorities for being involved in a murder investigation. But yeah, as if that wasn't enough, shortly after, the couple would just straight up flee to Europe together. They would end up in Bangkok, obtain new identities, and spend New Year's drinking vodka in Moscow as Tim and Julia Holt. They would attempt to settle down finally in London after this, and it was there that they would start a small fraud spree, cashing fraudulent checks and returning items for cash at department stores. It was at one of these stores that a suspicious employee would have them flagged down by a plainclothes officer. Then on May 29th of 1986, so just a little over a year, a call would come in from London to Ricky Gardner, who was still working the Haysom murder case. He would be on a plane to London 4 days later and would interview Jens. Jens would later claim that he requested a lawyer and was threatened, but this story would come out. He would claim that he drove to the Haysoms to try and talk things out with them, but he said that Elizabeth stayed in Georgetown to create an alibi if one proved to be necessary. That's why they got tickets to Porky's Revenge and the other movies. He would say that he had a few drinks with Elizabeth's parents. Afterwards, everyone started to argue. As he got up to leave, Elizabeth's father, Derek, got up and slammed him against a wall, and he hit his head. At this point, Jens grabbed a knife and struck Derek in the neck, and he started bleeding. Nancy ran up with a knife, but he grabbed it, then her, and used her like a human shield against her husband, who was attempting to beat him with a spoon at this point. He then slashed Nancy's neck with the knife and let go of her. He says the next thing he remembers is tossing everything that was bloody into a dumpster at the end of the road and trying to spread the blood around Nancy to obscure his footprints. He made it back to meet Elizabeth after she had come out of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Apparently, they bought a couple of tickets to a few movies that evening. Both Jens and Elizabeth would be subsequently evaluated by psychologists. Elizabeth would be given a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and Jens would be given a diagnosis of shared delusional disorder, or Follie A Duex. That May, she was extradited to Virginia, where she was sentenced to 2 consecutive 45-year sentences as an accessory to murder before the fact. She echoed Jens's original confession and claimed that although she definitely fueled the idea to kill her parents, he was the person who acted on it. Her point was that he didn't have to, and she's right, but here's a clip of her testifying in her trial.
Oh, you didn't want the murder.
No, sir, I didn't. My irresponsibility, my manipulation of the evidence, Yes, I'm totally guilty. I'm totally responsible for my parents' death. I accept that. But what I want you to realize is that Jens acted of his own free will. He had a choice. He had a choice. He had a full-hour drive whether he killed my parents or not.
When it was Jens's turn to be tried, it opened like this.
What you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
And what year were you born?
1966.
I'd like to call your attention to March the 30th, 1985. On that day, did you go to the home of Derek and Nancy Haysom, kill Mr. and Mrs. Haysom?
No, I didn't.
What? So at first, Jens was fighting his extradition. Jens was trying to get tried in Germany because a life sentence there would be 10 years, whereas in Virginia, he would initially be facing the chair. He would go on to say that he was innocent and that he was actually in Washington when the murders occurred, and that he confessed in an effort to spare Elizabeth. He mistakenly thought that because his father was a diplomat and he had a diplomatic passport, that he would have diplomatic immunity. He was thinking that the 10 years at most that he would spend behind bars in Germany would be worth sparing Elizabeth's life if she was convicted. Romantic? You tell me. But the important part of Jens recanting his confession is that he said Elizabeth had in fact killed her parents, and he was the one who stayed back in Washington to provide her with an alibi. This was actually a huge extradition case between the US and UK, but ultimately the UK decided that they would extradite Jens only if they would agree not to pursue the death penalty, which they ultimately did. His trial would begin on June 1st of 1990 and last for 3 weeks. They would enlarge a photo of the crime scene and compare a police footprint of Jens's with a transparency sheet, and it seemed like they were an exact match. Jens also had O-type blood, which was found at the crime scene. Elizabeth would testify against him and state that she wasn't actually thinking he would kill them. Her mind wasn't there, but you've heard her letters to him. Come on, girl. She would also contradict herself a bit. One example of this was at first she would state that she went to the movies that they bought alibi tickets to. Then she would just say she bought the tickets and left. She would go back and forth on whether her mother had abused her sexually as a child as well. So it's unfortunate, but both she and Jens seemed to be hard to believe because they literally seemed to say whatever they thought would suit their situation best at that moment. But did he actually kill Elizabeth's parents? Or did she? The second type of blood found at the scene was type B, which is Elizabeth's type. And the tennis shoe prints were smaller than Jens's shoes. He would claim that she must have done it and had help. She would claim that he did it. But if he didn't have help, how would that explain the smaller footprint and the type B blood at the scene? Maybe they did it together? I think that seems like the most logical conclusion, or that possibly Elizabeth had another friend with type O blood and the same size feet as Jens, but because it couldn't be proven that either of them actually stayed behind, I think they must have done it together. What do you guys think? Anyways, in the end, Jens was found guilty for the murder of Derek and Nancy Haysom and sentenced to the maximum punishment agreed upon, life in prison. He would be eligible for parole in 2003, but had over 12 parole requests denied. A petition for absolute pardon was filed on August 22nd of 2016, and it wasn't granted, but both he and Elizabeth were released without being pardoned and sent back to their respective countries. Canada for Elizabeth and Germany for Jens in 2019. The state of Virginia would say this release was cost-based and not merit-based on both counts. This one is just wild because we still don't completely know what happened. It really could be either or both of them. What do you think? Anyhow, as always, let's try to end today on a more positive note. Today I am going to highlight the deportation law, or article that kind of kept Jens from facing the death penalty, and that's Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. This article simply states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. Soren versus the United Kingdom is cited as a case that highlights this article. The death penalty itself is not considered inhumane, rather, waiting in prison for years to be executed is. This is termed the death row phenomenon, or sometimes called death row syndrome. The idea is that it's basically psychological torture to keep someone alive for that long to kill them. Insanity, delusions, and suicidal tendencies are cited as some of the negative side effects, which makes sense. Our legal system is backlogged as it is, and each condemned prisoner is allowed quite a few appeals before they are actually put to death in the states that still have the death penalty. So obviously that can take some time. This is also why it is more expensive to execute someone in the States when compared to housing them in prison for life. In this specific case, the UK refused to extradite Jens if he would face this, and it seemed like in the end that worked out for him. What do you guys think about this concept? I think it's a good thing all around, especially in this instance. I know I said I'm opposed to the death penalty, especially in this case where they probably did both do it, but there was a chance that one of them wasn't anything more than an alibi and I suppose an emotional accessory or accomplice. Anyhow, this will be my last Follie A Duex case for now. I love looking into cases like this though, where someone may or may not have killed but for another person. It's interesting to me. What about you guys? All right, next week is Halloween, isn't it? And we'll see. Everything we talk about gives me the spooks, but we'll see what I can come up with. And until then, please stay safe out there. Bye.